the barbarity of the Hamas attacks that day had this extra layer of evil. It wasn't just the raping and the murdering and the torture and the kidnapping. It was the fact that the attackers took such glee in their actions. I think it's a lot more than that. I think that the vacuum that you write about in your book on Frankl, among other things, I think that vacuum that many young people at elite institutions are feeling has been filled up by the worst ideology of all. I mean, there are many answers to meaninglessness in life, but to decide to find meaning in a group that is explicitly in favor of death for others and for itself plays to some of the darkest parts of the human psyche.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch, therapist and author of Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul. We have with us a very special guest today, Mr. Douglas Murray, who is a world-renowned journalist, defender of Western civilization, and author of a new book called On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Douglas, welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
I want to start by saying congratulations on your new book that finally tells the truth about what happened on October 7th and the atrocities committed by Hamas. But before we dig into your book, I want to share with you as a psychologist who treats trauma and learning the lessons of the Holocaust and the inspiration of Viktor Frankl. With what I'm seeing today, I think we might be in similar times of what Viktor Frankl experienced almost 90 years ago today. There was a few days ago, a chemical attack that left, I just read, up to 15 people perhaps wounded. And this was by a group of Jews just protesting peacefully to release the hostages in Gaza. What are your thoughts about that? Are we back in the 1930s or something worse?
I'm always loath to see history as a sort of endless replay of the 30s and 40s, because I'm concerned about the number of things there's so little in our culture at the moment that is understood by everybody or known about by everybody. World War II is probably the last unifying story in a way, the last unifying bits of knowledge. And of course, as you know, it isn't, because very few people understand what actually happened then anyway, but it's something that people have common reference to. And so there's always this just instinctive thing in me that says, oh, let's not go to that analogy. And yet, of course, the reason why the analogy does work is because what happened in the 30s and 40s is about the best template we have of how civilized societies can completely dement themselves, end up with scapegoating and much more, end up in conspiratorial thinking, and then go all the way to hell. So, I suppose I would always say that, I can't remember who it was who's credited with saying it first, but that famous thing, history doesn't repeat itself necessarily, but it does rhyme. And I think what we're hearing at the moment are sort of rhymes of events 90 years ago.
Yeah, the rhymes of October 7th as well, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about your new book. I believe it's in one of a series of books that you started writing in 2017, beginning with The Strange Death of Europe, The Madness of Crowds, and The War on the West. But I must say there's something rather riveting and profoundly personal. On October 7th, you write that you were in New York City and you heard the news and you decided to come to Israel and cover the war firsthand. What did you see when you arrived? What happened on October 7th that the world needs to know?
I think several things. One is that obviously, to look into the events of that day and to speak to the survivors and to hear the firsthand accounts and so on, is to speak with people who stared into hell. I think that's probably the most explicit way one can put it, is that they saw the face of not just evil, but of that special, something I mull on in the book, as you know, which is that special variety of evil which takes glee in the evil. And that was something I found very hard to work out, although I certainly tried, was the barbarity of the Hamas attacks that day had this extra layer of evil. It wasn't just the raping and the murdering and the torture and the kidnapping. It was the fact that the attackers took such glee in their actions. I think that the people who suffered through that day, yes, I mean, got a real glimpse of evil in its rawest form. I think that and you know this very well from your work, but I think that the issue of what the trauma is in Israel is very important. I say at one point in the book, I quote a therapist I spoke to who was working with some of the survivors of the Nova Party, who reminded me, not that although people were talking about post-traumatic stress, this was too early because it wasn't post, the trauma was ongoing. And I mean, the trauma in a way could only be post when the remaining hostages are released and when every Israeli in the Gaza envelope and indeed in the north at the Lebanon border knows that they can be secure in their homes. And until those things happen, people sort of say, when would be the end of the war? And that would be the beginning of the end that would be the end of the war and the beginning of the post-traumatic stress period. But it's a profound challenge, I think, to Israelis that this could happen. And I think that this very deep level of trauma is how this is the place where we're meant to be able to be safe. Yes, we know that people will fire rockets at us and we have to find more and more ingenious ways to shoot them down and so on, but not that Jewish families would be hiding in safe rooms and be burned out of I mean, that's the bit that I think that Israeli society will have a long time recovering from.
Let's talk about what you witnessed when you got to Israel after October 7th. Really some incredible stories that you write about in your book from survivors, loved ones, heroes. And I just can't help by noticing, as you know, I'm an author of the book on Viktor Frankl, there's similarities to Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
Themes of tragedy and heroism, emptiness versus meaning.
Yes.
Those who glorify death with those who choose life in spite of their situation. There's one story, Douglas, that really haunts me. It's the story of Gil, who threw his body on a hand grenade to save his sons. Could you please tell our viewers the story about Gil and the Hamas attacker, which you write was drinking a Coke flippantly afterwards?
Yes, that's a story. Obviously, as you know, as an author, you have to decide, particularly when there are millions of stories, you have to decide which ones you focus on and which ones in a way are both emblematic and unique. And that was one that struck me because yes, there's a family in the south of Israel, and they the older boy, in his late teens, was actually at the beach with friends when the attack began, and of course it began by sea as well as air and land. And some of the terrorists came in, they killed him and his friends where they were sheltering, and then went on to the community his parents lived in. And the attackers, the terrorists, yes, these two boys, the younger boys, who I think were 10 and 12 or so, were in their home. They go to the bomb shelter with their father, and the one of the terrorists on video, I've seen it a number of times, on video, one of the terrorists throws a grenade into the shelter. There's an explosion, and then the boys stagger out, and one of them had one of his eyes blown out, and the other one of his ears. And they were staggering around, and there's a footage of them in their living room. And yes, it turns out that their father threw himself on the grenade, and to protect the lives of his sons. The younger son they're both obviously deeply traumatized and scared and much more. But the younger boy also is in complete denial, that what has just happened has happened. And, sort of, where's father? And the other boy is like, what do you mean? You just, and as it happened, yes, one of the terrorists who just killed their father comes into the room that they're in and just opens the fridge and helps himself to the contents. And that story was one of many that stuck with me. But one of the things was, of course, the proximity of extraordinary life-saving heroism and life-ending sadism, just in these few square yards and a few minutes, actually, that a father sacrificing his life for his son to save his sons should be in such proximity to a man who just wanted to kill, wanted to take delight in murder and sadism, really.
What were some of the stories that stand out in your mind now, almost 100, 600 days after the effect? What stands out in your mind?
For me, it's a number of things. One is, of course, all of the first-hand things I witnessed in the, I suppose, like everybody, I mean, not to get too graphic, but like everybody who saw this, that I mean, just the extremity of the violence was beyond words. There was just nothing that can be done to a human body that was not done by the terrorists that day. But the other thing is, of course, I suppose, again, it's a very interesting subject we've both written about. But on the one hand, it's to wrestle the good from a moment of evil is, in some ways, doesn't feel like it's the point. An evil thing does not occur in order to morally improve other people or to give us lessons. But yet, at the same time, there is that instinct to seize on and highlight what is good in the middle of such things. And that's why I bring out the stories that also really stay with me, which is the stories of the sheer heroism. As a young man I write about, whose girlfriend I met, who they were at the Nova party, and he managed to drive a car full of strangers out of the party. He managed to find a way out. The Hamas were shooting everyone in the backlog of cars trying to get out of the party from the main entrance, and so that was impossible, and everyone who went that way died, were killed. And but he managed to find one of the other routes out that had not been blocked by Hamas, and he saved a car full of, I think, 5 other young people who had been at the party, drove them 20 minutes away and drops them off, and then drives back and then does it again. Yeah. And then he drops them off and drives back and does it again. And
people were warning him not to go back.
Were telling him not to go back, that it was death, it was too dangerous. But he was on a mission. He had a mission. And the last time the Hamas killed him and the people he was trying to save. But he must have saved more than a dozen lives that day. And that's extraordinary.
Extraordinary heroism.
Yeah. Heroism. And the heroism of saving strangers, in a way, is even more striking. That you would continually risk your life to save others. Like, that seems to me to be one of the highest forms of virtue, if not the highest.
I'm reminded of the story of Sapir Cohen, who, when she was going down to the tunnels, instead of worrying about herself, she went into a mode that Viktor Frankl talks about. And I'm not sure that she's ever read Man's Search for Meaning, but she was thinking about how can I help other people in the tunnels right now? How can I help them? That was something that Viktor Frankl comments that, those who believed they were going to fulfill some meaning in the future after the camps, they didn't know if they live or die, were most apt to survive. Just a fascinating psychological phenomenon that she represents.
Why do you think that occurs?
I don't know exactly, but I do believe there is, well, we could talk about, Sigmund Freud's understanding of the self, the id, but the thanatos, the desire for death, death impulse. Frankl talked about something called religio in a very obscure book called The Unconscious God.
Mm.
And he believes there was this spark of godliness, he calls it the unknown God within. For some people, it just gets manifest in such times. I'm not sure where it comes from. I believe it's an unconscious reality. As much as the Thanatos or it is unconscious, this religio is unconscious, and she seemed to experience it at that very moment.
Yes, because on the one hand, it could be a way to, what would you say? It would be a way for the self to survive by not prioritizing itself
Correct.
or itself into others. But it is a version of that thing I write about in the book about that just that extraordinary key insight commandment of choosing life that is so obvious in a way and yet needs saying. Clearly needs saying perhaps today more than ever.
Let's talk about the psychology of the perpetrators for a moment, referring to Hamas, the Islamic Brotherhood, the mullahs in Iran. I'm intrigued by the term you use in your title, death cults. I would postulate that the Nazis were some form of a death cult,
Yeah.
and Hamas is a new type of death cult. Could you share with us what are the ideas, the philosophy, the psychology of people like Hamas and the dangers it poses to the civilized world today?
Yes, I mean the psychology is very hard for much of the Western mind to comprehend, I think, because it sounds so, well, fanatical and impossible. Um, I unless you understand a sort the Islamic version of a sort of millenarian fanaticism, everything that Hamas seek to achieve seems impossible. It seems ridiculous. But I've spent enough time studying movements like Hamas to know that what they say is really what they mean to do. And that, for instance, the eradication of the Jewish people is something they see as being not just desirable, but achievable. And that they're going to give it their best shot. Which is what they did on the 7th of October. They definitely gave it their best shot to date. Now, in a way, it's in common with a large number of death cults in the past. Not just that the Jewish people happen to be number one in their sights, but that this could solve all other problems. I mean, that's one of the. Obviously you saw that with the Nazis, the belief that if you eradicated the Jewish people, like that would solve all the problems and release all of the other things that could be done in society, as if the Jews were sort of a block in the way. And obviously Hamas have the same view. Hezbollah have the same view. The mullahs in Iran have the same view. And among much else, it's a reading of a religious doctrine. It's a version of it, the worst version, it has to be said, but a version. I mean, it comes from a form of fanatical Islamism, and they really do think that blood and death have the ability to sort of cleanse. And that's, of course, all sorts of death cults throughout history have had that misguided belief, you know, the people who will never tire of other people's blood, you know.
Well, I
And
think Hamas says this in their protocols. They mention this.
yeah, yeah,
They
yeah,
say
it's in
it,
the
so we have to
charter.
take them seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the charter, it's in everything. And one of the interesting things that will have to be addressed at some point in Israel is why there was a misconception that Hamas were by now, by 2023, in a position that so many fanatical groups have been in history, which is that they had lost interest in their original fanaticism and just wanted to enjoy being corrupt. And of course, that is very interesting because that has been a story of many fanatical movements. I mean, one thinks of the 1980s in Soviet Russia, where, I mean, nobody believed it anymore. It obviously didn't work. But the elites, as it were, in Russian society, the Communist Party, were willing to just keep the thing going, and they would enjoy the benefits of corruption at the top echelons of society and just have a nice time. You know, why there was such a misconception in parts of Israeli society and intelligence, military, government, maybe, is a big question, because of course Hamas showed that you can be both corrupt and fanatical and really mean it, and put everything on the line, including your whole society, Gaza, in order to achieve your fanatical end goals. So it's not just that they're happy being, you know, making the Hamas leadership, as I say, mentioned in the book, all billionaires. And one interpretation would have been, well, maybe they're happy just being billionaires, living in Qatar in luxury penthouses, and they'll shed the fanaticism. But the fanaticism wasn't shed. It was what they wanted to do. That's why Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, is such a sort of crucial figure in this book, and of course in the wider story, because he was the fanatic's fanatic. A total pathological psychopath who sought to bring death in its most gruesome forms, and that's one of the reasons why he's so fascinating. Because as I quote in the book as well, you know, I mean, that's I think we could probably say with some certainty that Sinwar was a psychopath. But what he worked on was to create a society of sociopaths.
But just realize the juxtaposition. That's the same Sinwar whose life was saved in an Israeli prison, but a dentist noticed a growth in his brain and saved his life eventually. This is the juxtaposition right there.
It's such a painful story, that one, because yes, a dentist in the prison where Sinwar was in the 2000s, where he was in prison, in Israeli prison, as you know, for killing Palestinians with his own hands. His conversations with the dentist in the prison, who is the one who identifies that he's stumbling when he's getting up from prayers and so on, and realizes it's probably a brain tumor, sends him off to an Israeli hospital where his life is saved. And yes, and as it happened, that man who saved his life had a nephew in Nir Oz on the 7th who was murdered by Sinwar's forces. It's all so horribly close and tied up everywhere, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. So we have the front, the death cult front from Hamas and their friends. But we also have that alliance between the death cult and the left. Some call it that red-green alliance. We saw it spill out on the campuses over the last year and a half at Columbia and Harvard and other places. We see Greta Thunberg, who is a proponent of a greener world, yet she unites with the Islamic fundamentalists. So how is it possible that people who proclaim to fight on behalf of the victims adopt the philosophy of the murderers? Is this the madness of crowds that you write about in your book?
It's an astonishing one, this, and I mean it'll be a long time till it's fully unwrapped, if it's ever unwrapped. Yes, how did a uh, part of a youth generation which had been brought up on, believe all women, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and so on. How did they come across Hamas and decide to side with Hamas and not the victims of Hamas? Why 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 did they adopt wholesale the Hamas sort of worldview to the extent of dressing as Hamas, covering their heads in kaffirs and terrorist chic? And how is it that, for instance, at Princeton University the other day, once again, students were chanting by the hundreds, "Glory to our martyrs"? I mean, this is a totally imported ideology. I mean, what is "our" in that chant? Why our martyrs? Maybe if you were a Palestinian born in Gaza, it's understandable if you start to talk about our martyrs. But what would the so-called martyrs in Hamas have to do with the hour of students at Princeton University, other than that they've decided to throw themselves full scale into a conflict about which they know nothing and side with the people who started it? I think there are very, very dark things going on in this. And inevitably, some people think it's anti-Semitism or just anti-Semitism. I think it's a lot more than that. I think that the vacuum that you write about in your book on Frankl, among other things, I think that vacuum that many young people at elite institutions are feeling has been filled up by the worst ideology of all. I mean, there are many answers to meaninglessness in life, but to decide to find meaning in a group that is explicitly in favor of death for others and for itself plays to some of the darkest parts of the human psyche.
Yes, we're seeing it. We're seeing the id revealed, or the thanatos revealed.
Okay.
Frankl warned about this prophetically 75, 80 years ago.
Yes.
He said, unlike the Viennese culture, which was dealing more with sexual repression, that was let out of the box by Freud, he said that the greatest challenge facing humanity would be the lack of meaning. He called it the existential vacuum. And
Yes.
you are indeed correct, Douglas. I believe that that's what we're watching it now, is as the emptiness increases, things like even Hamas can slip in. The death cult philosophy and psychology slips in, but let's talk about, perhaps there is some type, if we do a Venn diagram and we see the, what they share, these two movements. Let's talk about anti-Semitism for a few moments. You have a remarkable theory that I've never really heard before. And you quote in your books and in some of your speeches about a fellow named Vasily Grossman. He was a fantastic Russian writer, journalist, and so on. How did you discover this obscure figure in Jewish history and rely on him for your theories? How did you find out about him?
Oh, I don't think he's obscure, Vasily Grossman, but he certainly hasn't yet got the renown he deserves. His work took a long time to be translated into English, and we almost didn't have his masterpiece, Life and Fate, because the Soviet authorities did not want to see it published. I learned about Grossman some 25 years ago, actually, from a Persian writer friend of mine, who I remember, she, sadly no longer with us, she said to me that there were only two great novels of the 20th century, The Leopard of Giuseppe de Lampedusa, obviously, and Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. And this friend was a very strict literary critic, and she also had a very funny rule, by the way, which was that nobody should be allowed to publish books that were over 250 pages. We said, if you have something to say, you can say it in under 300 pages, but the fact that she recommended this 900-page novel suggested to me that this was indeed something to contend with. It took me many years actually to get around to it, but I realized that Life and Fate, which is about the midnight of the 20th century, of Grossman, who covered the Battle of Stalingrad as a journalist, and also was the first journalist into Treblinka, and who, in an extraordinary piece, which I refer to in the book, described what happened in Treblinka. He was one of the first people to piece it together. So this was a writer who really understood the midnight of the 20th century. And yes, and I was just blown away some years ago when I read it by the fact that this extraordinary descriptive novel, a sort of 20th century War and Peace, I suppose, is one of the ways it might be described, that at the very midnight of the novel, the middle of the novel, he takes 4 pages out from the narrative to address the question of anti-Semitism. And I was blown away by it because it's so good. I mean, he says almost everything. Anti-Semitism obviously is an extremely, sadly, rich subject, and there's been a lot said and written about it. But he says almost everything that needs to be said about it. And also, it was so structurally striking to me that this was the only way he could do it, was to like pause the narrative and then address this question. And of course, you know, he makes the observation there that I've been trying to make more widely known, more popular, which is the suggestion that he says, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of." His recognition that it is everywhere and always a form of projection, and that the anti-Semite tells us nothing about the Jews, but everything about themselves. So Grossman gives the example, for instance, of the fact that the Nazis accused the Jews of being racist and wanting to take over the world. Yes, that's the Nazis telling us everything about themselves. But I thought about that a lot, and I thought, well, I know what, if Grossman's rule holds, as I think it does, I know what other countries are doing. I know that when Erdogan in Turkey describes the Jewish state as being an occupying state, he's describing himself, because he still, and his country still occupies northern Cyprus. So I knew that. I knew that with the Ayatollahs in Iran, they accuse Israel of being a colonialist state because they're busily colonizing the Middle East from Yemen to Lebanon and elsewhere. I knew that worked with them. But the thing that I was thinking about a lot as I was watching the derangement of Western societies outside Israel the last couple of years was what's then going on with the people on the streets and in the elite institutions? What are they doing? And that's when I realized that of course the set of accusations that were being made against Israel were all very familiar, and not just from the history of the demonization of Israel, but they were all very familiar because Israel was being accused everywhere and always of being racist, colonialist, white supremacist, genocide.
Every few weeks, it seems to change. They add another epithet. There's another discourse.
And you know, that it's engaged in ethnic cleansing and always has been, and so on. And I thought, well, these are all things I've written about in previous books as being, these are the totemic accusations of our time. To accuse somebody of these things, or a society of these things, is to accuse it of the worst things, and certainly the worst things in our idiom. And then, of course, I realized that, well, these are all the familiar accusations, but they're also the things that people in the West have been told that we are guilty of. To be born in 21st century America is to be told that you are responsible for slavery and colonialism. And if you grew up in Britain in the last 30, 40 years, you will have been told that you were responsible for slavery, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And so, and as I said in The War on the West, I said, this is a very dangerous system that is being set up, because it is an unalleviatable guilt that is being put on people. You know, I mean, even if any of the charges were true, nobody alive today is responsible for any of these things. And I said in The War on the West, you know, that this was a very dangerous thing to set people up with a guilt mechanism that had no form of alleviation. And then I think I realized after October 7th that the state of Israel was going to be the perfect mirror for these people. if you are told that you are guilty of genocide, ethnic cleansing, white supremacy, racism, and so on, then what do you do about it? And the answer is, I will find a state I can accuse of doing that now and scream and holler and demonstrate and much more against that state, which is actually just a projection mechanism for the things I've been told I'm guilty of. And when I realize
And all we need is the existential vacuum as well. And then
exactly,
together they work perfectly well, don't they?
for me, this was a very important moment of recognition, and I've ever since I first saw that, or saw through that, I've just kept an eye open, and everywhere and always it's the same. And of course, the problem for the people who do that is it's worth always reminding them is the Jewish people do not exist as a projection mechanism for your own failings. You know?
Now, you speak briefly towards the end of the book about your own family. You mentioned your grandmother, who had family members in 1914, again in 1939, going to war. She loses her father and her brother in war. Um, I've been watching you for many years right now, and sometimes when I read your books, I'm reminded of the writings of Paul Johnson in the Intellectuals, and other times I'm reminded of Winston Churchill, who from the early 30s was virtually alone amongst British politicians in warning that Hitler's Germany posed an existential danger to Europe. Um, I'm so fascinated by you, Douglas. Um, where did your values come from? You keep speaking out, I believe, endangering yourself in Israel from bullets from Hamas, and I could even say leftists from the BBC. So who inspires you? Where's your strength and determinism coming from?
I think it's probably lots of things. I'm probably not very good at analyzing myself. I think it's many things. I mean, one is, I suppose, inevitably, I mean, my religious upbringing, definitely being instilled with good Christian values, I think definitely helped. Being very aware of and loving the culture from which I came, and wanting it to continue and do well and be added to rather than pulled down. Um, I I think probably a rarer thing though is being able to hold your own, even if you're the only person doing it. And I'm not entirely sure where that came from, other than that I've always admired people who could do that in the past. You know that
Holding your own in
yes,
spite of your
and
environment.
that and
Yeah.
that peer pressure, or you know, I don't want to walk with a crowd. Like I don't want, I don't need or desire to walk in lockstep with a crowd. In fact, the idea, I'm feeling myself bristling as I'm even describing it. I'm perfectly happy being the salmon going the wrong way up the river. And in fact, I'm never more comfortable than when I'm doing so. And I think that's probably because the people I admired and admire still, figures in political history, military history, intellectual history, are the ones who did that. And so I suppose it's a sort of developed superpower that you don't feel the need. I don't feel the need to have the applause of anyone, really. Um, and so I don't do things because I'm compelled to do them by some outside force, but only because I believe them to be true and write and make statements and arguments because I believe them to be true, even if they're unpopular or anything like that. And there must be some kind of, I think there is definitely a religious underpinning to much of that, and that I religiously as well have admired the people who have not gone with the crowd.
Took a stand. Yes, they took a stand. Yes.
Yes, you took a stand, and And I suppose I've gravitated to my life, or deliberately got around me in my life, people who I regard as being courageous, which is a something I sort of didn't really notice I was doing. Somebody, as you pointed, a very good friend pointed it out at my 40th birthday party, and he just mentioned that it was, I won't list the people, but of the people in the room who were my great friends, they were disproportionately for a very weird, bizarre array of backgrounds, a very wide, properly diverse array of backgrounds, but had this in common. And I probably had not I hadn't consciously done that, but that I had always wanted to surround myself with courageous people and people I admired. And I often admire them for that particular lone sort of attitude. I just add one other thing to that, which is, yes, I think that I was also brought up in the wake of the Second World War to know that one of the reasons why Britain had been good, and therefore my grandparents' generation, that I briefly referred to there, was that they had made these extraordinary sacrifices and had done so alone. You know, and in a way, that's part of the most important thing in the British psyche, is very well alone. And that's fine. Okay, you're facing down the world, but it doesn't matter. Very well alone. And funnily enough, there's a poem of Primo Levi's which I've had in my mind a lot in recent months for some reason. Very strange poem, 4-line poem, which he wrote, I think, in the 60s. It's a mysterious poem. I don't say that it exactly speaks to what I was just referring to, but he said, the place we're going to is silent or deaf. It's the limbo of the lonely and the deaf. You'll have to run the last lap, deaf. You'll have to run the last lap by yourself. I was always struck by that. But that last line in particular, you'll have to run the last lap by yourself, for some reason really struck me and stuck with me.
Can't help be reminded by what you're saying in terms of what Viktor Frankl, talked about. He did not know whether he was going to live or die in the camps, but he knew that the one thing he could change, which he calls the last of all human freedoms, is changing his attitude. And I think that's what you're referring to. This is the attitude of standing up for truth in spite of your environment. For you, that image of the salmon going back upstream. You've watched videos of the bears that try to eat some of them, but most of them get up to the top and they make it. So good for you. You also mentioned towards the end of the book, you mentioned your friends and family a few moments ago. They occasionally mentioned that somehow you had changed.
Yes.
What was unique about what you saw in Israel that made you change?
Yes, for me, it was a very, very striking realization. It sort of crept up on me, rather. When I wrote The Strange Death of Europe some years ago, I used to joke, by the way, people have often said to me that book is a depressing book to read, and I always reply, you should have tried writing it. But one of the things I was very conscious of when doing that book was that it was a very bleak subject and one that didn't seem to have an answer. But there was a fundamental distortion and deforming of the culture, which I love, and there seemed to be no answer to it. And yes, it was, I suppose, I don't know if anyone is instinctively pessimistic or optimistic. I don't like the idea because I think we all move around all the time. It depends what hour of the day you get someone, But I did notice that some of my natural pessimism had, strangely enough, disappeared in the middle of Israel in a war. And it was really because of this realization that what I was seeing was people who had their backs against the wall and continued to fight and live anyway. And there were so many examples, and again, it's strange amidst the horror to look for the good or so on, but it just glints out, doesn't it? And heroism, particularly selfless heroism in the face of real evil, was one of the things that stuck with me from very early on. And the other thing that stuck with me was this extraordinary realization, which I had, sometimes as a writer, as you know, that the moments of realization come in the moments between. So things that stuck with me and struck me were things like, a Friday night dinner in the middle of a war with the kids back from base, and everyone l'chaiming, and I think of one day alone, late last year. I went to the funeral of a young soldier who'd been killed the night before, actually at his base in a Hezbollah attack, and I went to this very upsetting funeral in the morning, and then in the afternoon had a friend's daughter's bat mitzvah, and all these things happening so close beside each other was incredibly profound for me, because I realized that this will to life is the greatest thing of all. And the will to life in the midst of horror and the insistence on life was something I saw not just discussed but embodied. I think that's probably what I realized was it was not something you talk about, it's something you do and you live it.
Something you experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
It really stuck with me.
It reminds me of the last part of your book where you quote Deuteronomy, where you've said, where it says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse, and therefore choose life. You also quote the Psalms where it says, I shall not die, but I shall live. I guess this brings us back to democracies and death cults. People could choose life, people could choose death, but you saw people choosing life. You experienced it at the Shabbos table. Is this also how democracies win?
That's really what I saw finally, was that is the answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
The answer to a death cult is to cherish life, and that, as I mentioned towards the end of the book, I'd thought for some 25 years on this phrase that the jihadists like Hamas like to use, which is, we love death more than you love life. And I always found it an almost insuperable problem, that what do you do with people what can you do in the face of such hate of people who not only want to bring death to you, but to their own side, to their own alleged people, and so on, and indeed to themselves. And the answer is to take up the challenge and to respond to it by saying there's nothing wrong with loving life. In fact, it's our power, and it's why we'll win. And so in a way to turn around the taunt of the jihadists, say, very well, you choose death. We don't.
You choose life. Douglas, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to urge everyone to pick up a copy of On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.